interest I had outside of skateboarding and heavy metal music at the time was writing. And this being the early 90s, people like Henry Rollins and Maggie Estep had made it kind of chic for punkers to be poets as well. So a couple of my professors helped me get some of my early writings published. For a few years after that, I guess it was 1997, I was finished, 97, 98, I was finished with college. And I kind of rode that wave for a couple years after that. I continued to publish when and where I could. If I couldn't find someone to buy a particular piece of writing, I would just self-publish. And music had always been a hobby of mine, and I never really restricted myself to one instrument. I always kind of thought it would just be cool to be able to play as many different instruments, and I would kind of pick up any instrument I came across and tinker with it. So by the time the Aries Mayhem album, the first Aries Mayhem album came out, my interest in music was less peripheral than it had been before, but yet I really didn't have any clear idea of what kind of music I would play. It was about 1999 I met Jim Seal, and like myself, he had been experimenting with a lot of different instruments, and he could play several different instruments. And but unlike myself, he actually had a little analog 4-track, and he was recording these kind of jazzy, bluesy instrumentals that he really had no idea what to do with. When he and I met and started spending time together, he took a real interest in my writing, and together we formed a little spoken word jazz noise group that we called the BS Project. And that was really just an extension of what I had already been doing with the writing, the poetry, and the prose. I wasn't really at a point where I felt comfortable writing lyrics, and I really wasn't at a point where I felt comfortable singing to any degree. So yeah, we just kind of did the spoken word thing, and those recordings were eventually released in a really limited run right to cassette. We didn't ever get around to putting that on CD. It kind of generated some more interest in my writing in a different way. Curious Folktales of a Doomed Culture was released. The intent was to just release it as though it were a book of short stories or a novel. That's why Curious Folktales was originally released without a band name attached to it. In the later years, I went back and renamed it the BS Project. Jim Seal and I always recorded and performed together as the BS Project. I guess it just, at the time, again, it didn't occur to me. I just kind of thought it would be cool to release it as though it were supposed to be a book of short stories or a novel or a book of poetry. Only half of that album was recorded on a 4-track. The other half was recorded on a play school, a little child's toy play school tape recorder that had an attached microphone you could speak into. I bought it at the Salvation Army for like $1. I would just walk around with this little play school tape recorder and just record my poems, record versions of my poems. When I had all of the material for Curious Folktales that Jim and I had recorded together, it really wasn't long enough to justify, releasing as an album. So I just went back and plugged in a bunch of those play school recordings. At that time, Jim had already moved to Baltimore for the first time. So yeah, it did kind of make, it was kind of pointless to try to pursue. We did send tapes back and forth to each other for a while to try to keep the project going. And then, of course, in 2000, we did reunite briefly under the BS Project banner to tour down the East Coast and play some shows. But that was mostly just drunken debauchery that didn't really lead to anything.